excited to have Benjamin Bratton here with us today. Benjamin is the co-founder and director of the Center for Design and Geopolitics at UCSD, and which will be that'll be some of the initial questions will be to get a nice definitive sense of the work that you do there, which is I think quite fascinating. We've overlapped in many different contexts at Postopolis LA, which was an event I helped to organize in Los Angeles a few years back, where you gave a talk about undesigning the disaster, or undesigning the
emergency,
the financial collapse, the emergency, and then also similarly, then I spoke at your event in the spring. This will form sort of the bookend to an earlier conversation that Benjamin and I recorded earlier in the summer that will be published online in an edited transcript. And so as I was saying to Benjamin, there'll be a little bit of overlap with that conversation for the sake of new conversational participants. But otherwise, hopefully, we'll get into some new ground and catch up on what you've been doing over the summer.
Great.
I'd love to start off just first with the most basic question of all, which is, could you talk about the Center for Design and Geopolitics and just give a brief rundown of the remit of the center?
Yeah, sure. Thanks first of all for the invitation to speak here. The center is part of a larger institute called the California Institute for Telecommunications and Information Technology, or CAL-IT2, which was founded about 10 years ago, and it was one of 4 centers for research and excellence, they were called, which were not only trans-departmental, but above the school structure within the UC system as well, the divisional structure, the interdisciplinary research units. So there's one at Berkeley that focuses on biotech, there's one at UCLA that focuses on nanotech, and then there's the San Diego one, which is on information technology. So CAL-IT2, as I said, has been around for about 10 years. It's raised about $800 million in total grants from NSF and other sorts of things, and it's one of the premier institutes for really big science, cyber infrastructure, next generation health and medicine, energy technologies, and is really looking at it at a number of different scales, the way in which information technology can reconstruct and reinvent a lot of the foundational infrastructures that constitute our world. The Center for Design and Geopolitics within CAL-IT2 functions in a way sort of as the Institute's social and cultural and, to a large extent, economic think tank. And our focus with this is around, as the title would suggest, a kind of geopolitical scale. The question that we're really looking at is how it is that planetary scale computation, which I would argue is a scale that computation has not yet achieved, how planetary scale computation both deforms and distorts traditional Westphalian models of political jurisdiction, sovereignty, and geography, and produces new territories in its own image. What we're interested in then is how the configuration, those transformations within the geometry of political geography, that planetary scale computation reach within multiple scales, from the kind of cloud infrastructure of submarine cables and so forth, up to the architectural and urban scale ubiquitous computing systems and active interfaces, constitutes the possibilities of rethinking and understanding what political and economic sovereignty might be like. So we see this essentially as a design problem. So it's not so much, it's less, let's say, design operating at a geopolitical scale than it is taking the geopolitical as itself a design problem, and one that the collective, the composite agency of planetary scale computation has put on the table again in ways in which that we need to reconsider.
I'm curious about that use of the word design, because one, you could have called it the Center for Computation and Geopolitics, but you chose design. But then also design has a sense of of agency and purpose, and that someone has actually there's an actor or a series of actors or a constellation of influences that are doing something with a reason. Otherwise, it would be not design, but it would be emergence or emergency. And I'm just curious about that, the idea of who the author is in this sense, and if are you analyzing the actual production of a group, or are you looking at the epiphenomenon of linked technological assemblages?
It's both, and both cases can sort of start the research questions that we focus on. I mean, I think we're calling it design. I mean, within this particular institute, I think computation is taken as a given. The whole institute as a whole is focusing on the structure of computation. So, the specificity of design within the larger construct of the institute is the way we sort of frame the research program. But design within this is we might take as design as in designation, as design within the kinds of conception, projection, and modeling of alternate systems that might organize the kinds of field conditions that you've identified both at multiple sorts of scales. So our interest in the research, each of the research projects, I can talk a little bit about, I'm sure we'll talk more about, in many cases start with a technological possibility. For example, like one of the research tracks that we've been working on, been discussing a lot with Ed recently, is called Deep Address. And Deep Address, in essence, is a project around massive and highly granular addressability. So think, for example, of, the sort of classic example is IPv6. So IP4, we know we've run out of IP4 addresses. IPv6 is a 128-bit string of address space, right? So we've run out of IP4 access. You do the math to try to figure out how long would it take to run out of IPv6 addresses. A 128-bit string. It works out for 7 billion people to something around 10 to the 23 addresses per person. Okay. Which is many more stars than we know about. More orders of magnitude more cells in your body. The 10 to the 23 is roughly, as has been who does these calculations, but estimated the number, the number of grains of sand on the planet. Okay. So that's 10 to the 23 per person, which means in principle all 7 billion people could assign and individually address every grain of sand on the planet. Okay, so part of what this project is about is obviously people have done a lot of interesting work in this sort of ubiquitous computing space about toasters talking to refrigerators and cars talking to this, and there's an anthropocentric scale by which systems that we already understand how they operate, how could they be transformed or made more efficient or made more reflexive if these objects are imbued with some sort of computational capacity to exchange information between each other. We're looking at a deeper level of granularity within this. For example, we could say if you tried to assign an address to everything that you ever came in contact with over your whole life, you would never exhaust your 10 to the 23. Right? It's like every piece of paper you've ever touched or every book you've ever touched. It's more like every molecule in the ink on every piece of paper that you've ever touched. It's the way it's so you can assign these addresses to each of these objects. This recorder, that recorder, this water, the camera, and so forth and so on. But you would never possibly exhaust this address space. However, and this is what's I think very interesting as we're thinking about this, you can also assign an address to not just things with mass, but conditions of relations between things with mass. So there's this recorder that's here, but there's also the fact that I'm sitting next to the recorder, and Jeff's sitting next to the recorder, and Ed's sitting proximate to the recorder. Each one of those conditions of relations between things with mass could be individually addressable as well. Yep. So the addressing of these relations between things, you could, as another sort of potential for a kind of infinite refraction, where the relations between these and the relations, and another order of relations upon which those are dependent, right? The metals that have gone into this, the location of the metals that have gone into it, the person who brought the metals to location, touch to the point that you could exhaust that address space almost instantly. if you were to have this infinite refraction of addressability here as well. Yeah. So with this particular project, we started with a technology that was, and again, these sort of addressing technologies are all very embryonic. There was this IPv6 transfer day a few months ago, but the actual deployment of these addresses is all sort of premature, is all very much in process. We begin with an emergent technology, and we begin to do experiments, sort of prototyping and exploration and speculative projects with these technologies in order to explore them as, in essence, as political philosophical armatures, as problematics, to do these techniques in order to work through what we take to be these political philosophical problems as well. So that's an example where we started with a technology and kind of tried to extrapolate, and we can talk more about that research initiative. We try to extrapolate the philosophy from it. In other cases, the research projects will start with something that's a kind of more readily identifiable design brief for that's operating at a kind of more socio-political level. So we have another research track that's about which we call Re-CA or Re-California, and it's all about taking the California, the jurisdiction of California, as a single design problem, and how it is that California itself could be redesigned and restructured. And it begins with the conceit that California has seceded from the U.S. In California, there's some very fascinating maps. And for a long time, many of the Central Europeans maps of California and Western Europeans had it represented as an island, because they would go up the Sea of Cortez and assume that this was an island. So there's for about 100 years, there's a whole group of maps of California. And these may ultimately prove to be accurate.
250 million years?
No,
Okay.
No, we'll see how the secessionism. There's a pan-secessionism afoot, and in this case, we take this jurisdiction, and the jurisdiction itself becomes the design space in which we sort of work in. A number of things are brought to bear on trying to sort of reconceptualize how that might work and what the issues are there as well. And in that sense, we then drill down to all of the kinds of the technologies that us and our collaborators are working with, and they become employed or brought into the question that starts with a more recognizable political philosophical problematic, and so it can work both ways. So the question, we can start with the technology and go to the philosophy, or start with the philosophy and go to technology.
What sort of technologies might you bring to bear on the question of California?
Well, I think there may be. You can start with some of the things that we've been working with are more prosaic types of things. Like there's a long project we've been working on around the high-speed rail. How the high-speed rail could be understood. You've got Caltrans that's got some very smart people actually working on the high-speed rail, but in terms of as a railroad problem, right? What kinds of trains, where do the tracks go, what are the land throughputs, what are the ecological footprints of putting it through this direction and putting it through that direction, and so forth and so on. But there's nobody really working on the rail. For example, they're estimating 100 million fares a year going up and down the state. It'll be the single largest infrastructural project that California undertakes the next generation, if it gets built, right? It's already, we're doing this kind of science fiction about a science fiction already. We don't really know whether this thing will ever happen. But it'll also be a 200-mile-an-hour rolling supercomputer as it zooms up and down the state with 100 million people over the year, moving through different areas, and its potential to gather information, to process information with this captured audience is an enormously interesting opportunity to think about the movements of those kinds of populations through this space as a kind of mobile backbone and infrastructure for how the folding of the north and the south of the state, which have always been a kind of artificially separated central jurisdictions, can be moved into each other. So for example, there's a project we're doing with Intel's research lab, which is, they're very interested in mobile sensing, and particularly on air sensing. And so this is sort of looking at what if you put the air quality sensors on top of the train, and this is going through the Central Valley. You can actually do air quality analysis, pollen analysis, different sort of toxics in the air sort of analysis kind of this as well. And it's going to process that. There's a group at Google that was already doing a project on kind of essentially locative social media within the captured audience space of public transportation, and what kinds of sort of things we're working on as well. So these things are in many cases more the kind of conventional speculative design sorts of projects sort of as well. But I think it can go all the way down. What we'd hope for the project is that it can go much, much deeper than these kinds of things, and beginning to think about, if you've got a passport or a card, what kinds of things can that, in fact, do? What ways in which that this identity structure and the way the token and artifactualization of an identity within these sorts of token can be developed to produce different kinds of publics that might have been done otherwise.
There's an example that this is my paraphrase of someone else's paraphrase. So I don't necessarily know if this is historically accurate, but it's at least narratively relevant, which is that the existence of Los Angeles in some ways has, as a modern city today, has a lot to do actually as a deliberately designed, almost sort of like a decoy by financiers in San Francisco that wanted to build a port in Los Angeles in order to make sure that San Diego didn't become a rival for San Francisco. And so they sort of deliberately funded a port. Again, this is a paraphrase, but where the port of Los Angeles became the port it is today because it was deliberately built to sort of keep San Diego from becoming a super city in the state of California. So even with the history of California, there are interesting examples of design, what would the word be, interpolitical competition, becoming the physical design of a terrain or of a territory, and now we have what we consider the geography of California actually was a design problem, and it was one that cheat San Diego, which is interesting.
Not to mention the movement of right.
But even before the water issue,
this is quite possible. I mean, San Diego is the history of San Diego is one of a kind of multiple layers of real estate. Speculative real estate booms and crashes layered on top of each other in a sort of archaeological ruins going back and forth to each other. And there was a really big one back in the late 19th century where San Diego, because it was the biggest port city and it had grown very quickly as well, but the whole thing was a bubble that collapsed. In San Francisco, many kind of came in and bought up a lot of what was San Diego was there. And most of the bay in San Diego is completely artificial. It's not. There is no actual bay there. It's all been really designed.
With for example, the California project is helping to explore and articulate different jurisdictional kind of models as you sort of that would be the outcome of such a project.
It's really not. It's strange to put it this way, but the project isn't even really about California per se. It's really, the line California is America, but only more so. It's sort of California is the world, but only more so. And we're taking California as a sort of exemplar jurisdiction to work with to specify the possibility of designing a jurisdiction per se, designing a bounded sovereign jurisdiction, and what the possibilities of these sort of structures are. So the ultimate goal is not to complete that and to sort of have a finalized master plan for California, and none of the research projects really has this sort of as this goal, but rather to set up the research question in this way, and then there's a large number of in many cases heterogeneous individual projects that happen within this, and that sort of gathers together and we find out something about it.
I want to go back just briefly to the idea of infinite addressability, and it's a pretty abstract question, but I'm curious about, clearly in order to store all of these addresses, in order to designate objects with addresses, you need an archive, and you need something that will store all of this, and you need a place that will be a repository for that information. And so I guess I'm curious about the relationship between jurisdiction and an archive, and how the creation of an archive either becomes an act of founding a jurisdiction, or it gives the things within that archive the ability to have a kind of political agency that becomes jurisdiction later. So is there a connection between jurisdiction and archive, and do they require one another, or do they lead to one another?
Or maybe I would put it in the sense of jurisdiction and addressability. Right? We were talking about Crying of Lot 49, and the way in which the postal code and the postal addressability constitutes a kind of grid that makes it possible for something that exists, one thing to exchange information with another thing in a kind of point-to-point manner, but that the production and governance of that addressable grid is what makes that communication possible, and that this is not just a police mechanism. In a way, it's foundational to the way, what James Scott says, how states see. States see through the capacity to not just produce cartography and to produce the territory over which they would have dominion, but to grid that cartography into addressable entities that both so that it could be taxed, but also and vote, but also it can communicate according to that kind of structure. So by all means, part of the reason why that we see the Deep Address Project as ultimately something that is part of a speculative political philosophy is because at its very core, the kinds of the addressing systems are not simply a technique of governance; they are integral to what governance is as a project of constructing worlds. There's also very specific. There's also very interesting issues of just the technology of how you manage this. I mean, like the way in which, as we know, web routers work now. Each of the router has a kind of table of all the other sites in it. You can look things up and the rest of it. So when packets come through, and they say, "Here's where I want to go," and it says, "Okay, where is that?" and it sends it through, and it goes like this. When you're talking about this number of addresses, it's impossible to do this. The amount of having every router within this have to have a map of the entire system in its brain so that it can route the packets that come through is an impossible solution to this. So in the process of the address, there's also the way in which you need to redesign packets. You need to redesign packets so that they don't necessarily need to know exactly where they're going or to tell a router exactly where they're going. They just need to know almost a kind of vectoral topology, what direction they need to be sort of bumped into. Right? There's a general northeastness that they need to go on. And there's ways in which there's a group at UCSD called CAIDA, C-A-I-D-A, which is one of the main internet mapping initiatives. And they've done a lot of very amazing work on modeling hyperbolic topologies of the spaces in which packets can be routed through, which in ways in which they don't really appreciate are also quite remarkable forms of generating new cartographies and new maps of the world within this as well. That go which I think are very much back to our sort of question of what how planetary computation produces these new kinds of geographies. It's producing these geographies exactly at this level. Yeah.
What do formations of a state mean in that kind of internet routing situation?
Right. Yeah. It's where the state literally has dissolved. It's the Marxist that after a certain economic state that the state will dissolve into the fabric of everything. In this case, it begins having dissolved into the fabric of everything in this way as well. But this is exactly the question. It's both can we understand these kinds of operators in terms of a longer arc of the transformation of the state? If we agree, for example, with Scott or Latour and his, seeing like a state, that states are defined particularly in terms of what they're able to see and how they're able to, what they're able to see, how they're able to organize those things and construct those sort of domains of structure of composition and surveillance in their own image. These are those sorts of techniques, and do they constitute a state? And in a way, what way do they constitute a state, and in what way does the future of the state? Because certainly our argument is not that they're going away, right? If anything, especially the BRIC countries, this economies in emergence are strong state actors, not weak state actors. Is it rather than just that the state, that model of the state transforms in the image of its ability to govern these types of territories as opposed to the territories that it's traditionally defined its sovereignty in relationship to, or what is the relationship with these newer territories and older territories, and what are the opportunities and politics of managing those in different ways?
Yeah. Or just to go back to the James Scott example, it would be the idea of enforcing legibility or enforcing addressability on something that doesn't otherwise have designation or address or is considered illegible to the state. So. by pushing it into the light.
That's right.
So in this case, it's almost like the IT version of like AlphaZeres and interpolation.
It's exactly
interpolation by router.
It is exactly the IT version of AlphaZeres interpolation by router. Yes, something in fact, because something is hailed and made communicable. Something can communicate. I mean, everything communicates in a way, right? The Polaroid film communicates with light, and things communicate. There's a way in which something becomes addressable to the world in its natural form. And those are the capacities of its worldliness. But at the same, we're not talking about, but we're in a way in which you have a kind of non-local, a standardized form of non-local communication between these different types of things, and a standardized protocol for how those information exchanges between one thing and another thing would be structured. And that's always,
This is a really, really pretentious metaphor, but it's funny the way you're describing how information moves. It's no longer based on known routers that can be mapped. It's more about directionality, and the pretentious metaphor is that it'd be interesting to try to find
greedy packets.
Greedy packets.
Greedy packets. Yeah.
But it almost sounds like this sort of like Thor Heyerdahllian sort of ideas of navigating by stars in the South Pacific, or the ways in which old boating cultures would navigate geographies more on directions and currents and even tides and occasional glimpses of constellations, but otherwise it's more about directionality than it is about point-to-point infrastructure.
Yeah,
but
that's not pretentious at all. No, I think it's a fun. This is the idea. Yeah.
So I want to go back to this idea of the sort of where sovereignty and political action come into play for networks. And you have written about what you call the Google Caliphate, which I think is a really interesting and provocative term. And I'm curious about, when does something become so thoroughly organized and influential that it can exhibit the political power that normally we would associate with states? And so Google, for instance, as a network of servers and services that everyone sort of opts into and uses, can start exhibiting sort of a political action, even things like its offshore data havens that are floating in the sea and that kind of thing. So I guess I'm just curious about how technological networks or examples of information technology infrastructure can sort of make the leap into statehood, so to speak. And how does that happen, and what are the effects?
Well, let's unpack this a little bit. It may be that they're able to have effects. They're able to take on the work that states used to do without achieving the same scale or comprehensivity that states used to do. Part of the Westphalian model of the state was that there was a particular bounded territory, and that the linear bounded territory, right, what Sam Kronik was our student here, calls the topology of loops. The Westphalia is a sort of loop topology, and that within this loop topology, political representation, the monopoly of the law, the monopoly of violence, World Cup soccer teams, so forth and so on, are sort of bounded by this loop topology. It's quite likely that as IT reconstructs the geographies and the geometries of this geography, that it may very well take on fewer parts of the role, not necessarily all of them at once, or it may take on many more, and there probably be lots of different genres of the types of things that it does take on. And I think that's where this becomes sort of more interesting and complicated. I mean, because part of the argument that we're looking at is that it's not a sort of fundamental shift between that there's this two-dimensional Mercator map of the Westphalian era, and that the lines are being redrawn. It's not just that the lines are being redrawn, but rather that the topology that structured this map is being redimensionalized, if you like. And in some ways, it always has been. But one of the key ideas is that any person, a sovereign, an interpolated entity, whether it's you or me or the IPv6 in my water, is overlaid with multiple claims on its claims upon it, right? And that the state was always as a kind of ultimate composition of all of those multiple claims, right? A flattened image, like of all the sovereign layers that constitute that location or that person. The state is where those layers get flattened into something that is somehow comprehensive. Of course, this never ever really was true. There always were multiple layers claiming and operating upon any site or any person in different and specific ways. I think one of the things that the IT transformation theory has made more plain and has perhaps made more operational and more composable and more designable is that these multiple layers as such perhaps can be recognized less as an accumulation of exceptions to that normative structure, but rather as the normative topology by which sovereignty operates. So instead of the sort of loops on a flat plane, we have a stack. We have a stack model of the way in which sovereignty works. That is, I would argue, not so unlike the model of a stack within a hardware and software system, TCP/IP, OSI, so forth and so on. That there's that first of all, planetary computation, I argue, actually is coming to constitute a formal stack. Cloud computing, ubiquitous computing, and all on top of it. But just as a sort of abstract machine of these multiple layers, an abstraction of these multiple layers, this is perhaps the conceptual model of how it is we spatialize sovereignty in this way as well. So Eyal Weissman's stuff on the vertical elevations in Israel and Palestine, I think he makes a very good case of this is how this is not. He's dealing with this as kind of an exceptional case. And I think we can see in many cases that this is not so exceptional. So part of the question is, where within this stack do actors that we identify as sort of transnational IT actors, like Google, and other actors which are more traditionally bound by particular territorial claims within the Westphalian topology, for example, the state, how do they interoperate within that stack together? And clearly, in different places and in different locations, there will be different outcomes, right? The way in which, and we see this already happening today. So for me, the question is both: what are the ways in which? I would say in at least three ways. One is how does the IT absorb the role of the state? How does the state absorb the role of IT, or the state is redefined by its relationship between this? And then how do these both redefined things, in fact, interoperate with each other in ways in which there is no resolution? And in a way, it's really the irresolution of these layers, such that we come to recognize this stack not as a accumulation of enclaves and exclaims piled one on top of each other, but rather as the new normal. And then how do we design the stack? Design them through this sort of stack model that is this where the thinking's at.
And then what are the artifacts and platforms that make that legible, so that if you're not having a projection,
what do we have instead? That's the second. This is our second. This is the other research project, which is the second one, which we call Westphalia 2, which is essentially map making initiative. And we're working. One of the groups that we're working with on this is a Dutch design group called MetaHaven, who we've done a lot of, who we're going to work with, and is writing for our blog and other things. And this is a map-making initiative, right? It's first of all, what are the maps of these? How do we map the stack as it currently exists, which is anything from bioregional maps, linguistic maps, and just how do you take this structure of the space and repartition it according to different operators and possibilities of segmentation, right? It's not arguing that the segmentation of space and the introduction of partition into space somehow goes away. In fact, we may end up with more partitions than less partitions, more borders, not less borders. But that those can also operate in multiple dimensions, right? Both spatial dimensions, temporal dimensions, so forth and so on. And that the interiority of these multiple borders, or the sort of accumulation of interiorities of these multiple borders, becomes the basis by which the interpolation of the sovereign actor takes place, but also by which that interpolation could be hypothesized and designed, and we can make claims for it now in advance of the closures that are inevitably coming around it.
Another kind of silly example is just even when you go hardware standards protocols for how hardware operates, and including everything from like PAL video versus the video system we use here, or even the fact that when you go to when you sign into iTunes in a different country, it like erases your wish list, and it does and you can't listen to certain songs if you bought it in the United States, and you can't watch the BBC here, but you can, et cetera, et cetera. But
and if you
my point is that's a kind of partitioning of territory in a way that
So we already have, and then we can also go to lots of Amazon's cloud service. You sign up for Amazon's cloud service, you sort of pick the number. They have their own zones, geographic zones, where like you can send your data to this zone, or that zone, but not this one plus that one, or the DVD region.
You can only change your DVD region on your computer like 5 times. Before it's all over.
So I think things like there's a nomos of the cloud emerging. I'll explain what I mean by this, but I mean the Amazon cloud in particular, which is really, I think at this sort of level, those sorts of jurisdictions are very important. We've had time zones for a particular part of time, but we don't have time zone nationalism in the same way we have, right? There aren't, people don't.
Except for that Samoa example that we were talking about a couple of months ago, where they to jump across the international date line, but it's the second time they've done that. I mean, it's not quite the same thing, but anyway.
It's certainly using time zone as a way to construct an identity. There's an identity from this whole thing as well, but it's not like you don't have people from the Mountain Time Zone and the Pacific Time Zone having border face-offs, right? There aren't Minutemen groups lined up in Colorado, making sure that the Pacific Time Zone people don't come across, and making sure you change your watch before you come in. But why? I mean, perhaps not as equally absurd as what the types of things we do have down in San Diego around the cultural enforcement of borders with this as well. But someone whose work has become very important for me, particularly his much later work, is Carl Schmitt, who, of course, many people have been using in lots of different ways recently. But it's less his work on exception and sovereignty, from which he's known through Agamben and Chantal Mouffe and so forth, than a much later book which he wrote called The Nomos of the Earth, which was written in 1950. And the book is a really incredible type. It basically provides a history of the conceptual and structural logic of political geography from the Roman Empire through the birth of Europe and up into contemporary times, and how it is that the claims over the sovereignty of land versus the sea. At what point do we determine that land is going to be divided according to these loops, but that the sea is open in other sorts of ways as well? And the way he structures it is that there's also that the invention of air and aerial warfare in a way that is Virilio. 25 years before Virilio argues that the emergence of the air power in World War I is a making of the land into the sea, because it moves over these, it allows you to organize these things as well. Now, the nomos, and this is simply just the point I want to make with it, the nomos is his word for the organizing, the sort of stability, the organizing logic of the structure of sovereign space that gives form to the world order that would emerge from it. So nomos is not exactly world order. It's the spatial logic that would give form to a particular jurisdictional world order. It's a topology of the geography in essence as well. The argument, one of the things I think we're exploring with all of this is, does the cloud have its own nomos? Not just its own jurisdictional conditions like Amazon zones and DVD codes and things like this, but does it or can it and should it constitute a kind of nomos, an actual structure, a spatial structuring order, a logic of distance and territory, of interiority and exteriority, over the validity of partitioning one kind of space versus another kind of space, in the same way that the Westphalian nomos had an order that would say we divide land this way versus sea that way. And in fact, what is that? What is the nomos of the cloud? That's, as we've argued, is that answering that question, what is the nomos of the cloud, is the design problem of the next 50 years. That what we will all be wrestling with either directly or indirectly. Plus he intersects all these crazy anti-Semitic little things in the midst of it. So while he's going through, because it's Carl Schmitt, right? So while he's going through and talking about all, what the French idea of the no one owns the sea versus the English idea of everyone owns the sea, of course we blame the Jews. But
this is a completely different topic, but I read this text on the Spratlys.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could talk about the Spratlys a little, just because I feel like there's fascinating conversions.
This is unpublished. I don't know what to do with this text. So if you let me know what you think, what's supposed to happen with this, I have no idea.
Well, and then one thing that's interesting about the changing, the possibilities that IT is offering. One thing that, of course, is happening with Spratlys is that the possibilities that climate change is sort of offering, seems like the wrong word, whatever, foregrounding for, this kind of shifting idea of statehood and sovereignty and whatnot.
So let me just, for people that know, the Spratlys are a group of islands in the South China Sea that are claimed by, I don't remember, seven different countries, right? China, Malaysia, Vietnam, Singapore, I think. Brunei, Indonesia. I'm getting these things wrong. And there's really not much there. There's been sporadic attempts to settle the Spratlys, but there was really no native population to sort of speak of. But because of their position as a sort of 7-pointed triangle, the Septangle, between these different countries, and because of the minerals and oil and other things that are underneath them, their recent history, going back to the 60s, really, has been one country's navy coming up and putting its flag on the rock, and the other navy's coming up a few days later and knocking the flag off and doing the rest of this, and it sort of goes back and forth like this, 7 different flags on top of these islands over and over and over and over again. And it's long been identified as one of the, for people who follow these things in foreign policy circles, one of the, your top 10 places where World War III is most likely to start is in some kind of insane, some sort of, some shooting King Ferdinand sort of thing, in the Spratlys, where China decides to nuke Indonesia, and it all goes from there.
Someone takes down the China Mobile cell phone mast.
It all goes from there as well. Yeah. So one of the things among the things I'm interested in about the Spratlys is how they, within the idea that any point is in many ways already over-interpolated. It's not just that any of these sites or peoples are sort of interpolated by one kind of state structure, but that these models of comprehensive sovereignty are always over-interpolated. And Ayal's work on Palestine and Israel sort of one thing, but you can also think about, let's say, the very tense dynamics between a logic of the caliphate versus the logic of the state in Pakistan, exactly which is higher than the other one within the state. In the Spratlys, you have this very direct example of a place that has, these multiple claims being made for it, and yet somehow it exists. You can think of it either as a kind of catastrophic anomaly by which it's unclear as exactly what color it should be on the map in one way or another, right? And what happens when you add all those colors together and you get this purple-brown on the map? But it's in fact an example of a site that you can only be described. Its normative condition as such now, right? It's relatively stable condition going back 50 years is as a 7 flags on top of this one thing as well, right? And that this that normative condition of the 7 layers on top of the one site as opposed to thinking of that as this peculiar catastrophic anomaly, is probably more like what the future looks like. And so, using both sort of following the Spratlys as a real geopolitical case, but also trying to extrapolate the Spratly as a mode of geography, as a mode of space in and of itself, I think is sort of worth working with. Yeah. So, and worth speculating about, which is what this text obviously is a project that was done to organize that sovereignty. Yeah.
Which I thought was really interesting. I think we should more questions, but I wanted to. I thought that was very curious because so in this text there's a description of sort of a project by OMA to kind of commissioned by China to sort of there's going to be a sort of archipelago uniting territorial claim, political narrative, and everything all rolled into one thing. And what's amazing
and another claim on the space made by the John Frum Party,
right?
Which is from the Tahiti blasts originally. Yeah.
Well, and so what's amazing about it is that it doesn't have and the Tahiti blasts are also interesting here in that like these all seem to be sort of symbolic acts of design. Like the OMA project doesn't even have to get built for everyone else to be like, oh, well, okay, I guess China won. Like it is.
Well, the project became so well known and publicized as such that the fact of its projectness ended up sort of dissipating the other sovereign claims because it seemed like such a fait accompli that that's what was going to happen there.
Exactly.
But even if it didn't get built, it did its work.
The report was sufficient.
And
similarly with the French nuclear tests, sort of the report was sufficient, you know?
Yeah.
Just in many ways, the sort of physical instantiation doesn't need to happen. Very curious. Anyway, I don't know.
Yeah, we're getting dangerously close to being out of time, so definitely if there are other questions, I know there are many that I could keep asking, but if there's anything else that you guys would like to inquire, feel free to do so.
Yeah, I was just curious.
Yeah, please.
I stumbled on your website and saw the first picture I saw was of the Voyager interstellar record. Am I correct in that it did you on your website? I was wondering, did you use that as a metaphor, or did you do work with that? What interest was that in communication for your work?
That was, I think it wasn't, I don't think it was the first picture on the site. I think it was going to say for a course that I did at UCLA.
Somehow it was on the splash page and I clicked on that and
it was?
To your site, maybe.
Oh, no, you know what this is? Okay, so it's because you have a slow connection. because there's a way in which the site is set up to, like, there's a folder of sort of random images.
Oh, okay.
And that once you load the site, it pulls an image from some of the random images and shows you this, and then it sort of goes to the site. So if you have a fast connection, it loads. It sort of like loads and goes to the thing, and like almost faster than you can see it, and you're kind of like, did I actually see that? Is that there? So it was. I forgot that was even a feature of the site. So I think one of the things that I'm interested in with that as well is taking this as a cosmogram. And the cosmogram is these pictures of the entirety of the cosmos. Trying to sort of produce a comprehensive portrait of the space and structure that constitutes the world in this way as well. And the Westphalian model, and the way Kant took the Westphalian model as a kind of political cosmogram by which the idea of a cosmopolitanism could be imagined as a federalization of these little singular states, then this as well. The idea of with the Voyager record of a cosmogram of the whole of life and this condensation of life on a planetary scale into a small number of inscriptions, such that it would be communicated to God knows what, or how far into this going as well, seemed to me. I mean, first of all, it's both an incredibly beautiful and stupefyingly naive set of conclusions to make about how you would draw that cosmogram, within this as well. But maybe something in the idea of trying to assemble that cosmogram so to make it accountable to a future or a future, in this case, a species, but something to which we can't possibly know. Which goes back to Jeff's question of the archive. And an archive is, and this is just Derrida, but an archive is a kind of promise to an unknowable future. We assemble and organize what we're doing here and making it intelligible to questions that will happen in the future that we can't possibly anticipate, but that there's a responsibility of self-accounting to make what we're doing here both judgeable but accessible and usable to this future that might sort of take place. So the Voyager thing is making the archive communicable or accountable to an other that we can't conceptualize. But there's a way in which maybe in terms of this question of a geopolitical design, that the construction of these possible maps and possible sovereignties is also a way of trying to anticipate an organization, a nomos, for a future that may be us and maybe another, but one in which that we're nevertheless accountable to, because we are its ancestors.
Does that get more complicated and impossible to do as we are growing? I mean, you're saying stupefyingly naive just because it's almost an impossible task.
Well, I'm mixing up the Voyager. Maybe I'm mixing up the Voyager and the Pioneer, because one of them was the plaque and one of them was the Earth Archive, and I'm forgetting which one was which. But one of them was the Earth Archive. They sent out records, phonographs,
sure,
right, with gamelan and all kinds of stuff in it that would be sort of yeah. So
the instruction of how to play it.
How to make a record player, these sorts of things. Yeah. So, for example,
our gift to the universe, how to play a how to make a record
how can we make a record player?
It's like that absurd.
No, but some of the decisions about here's how we understand how proteins fold, we understand how the DNA works, these sorts of things as well. If you read the story of how Sagan sort of argued for the different kinds of things about where pointing our location was and these things, some of these are very ingenious kinds of things. But the sort of hairless, naked Caucasian couple sorts of thing is, very dubious description of what it's all about.
It's an unwatchably bad movie, but Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome actually has a group of sort of feral children who live in a cargo vault. One of them has what looks like a lacrosse stick with a record at the end of it. And he keeps pretending that he's playing the record and speaking to a pilot that crashed there, et cetera, et cetera. But it's a terrible movie, but I think it shows the limitations of trying to get people to listen to phonographs. I don't want to monopolize the question, but I guess I'm really tempted just to. I'm really curious if you can take if we have time for one more.
Sure.
George, you need to go. It's almost noon. Do you have to be somewhere? I think.
At the airport, I think my flight's at 4. I think I'm okay.
Well, you can answer this as quickly as you can.
We're good. We're good.
I guess I'm just really interested in the idea of drone warfare and the idea that we have quote unquote undeclared drone wars, and we're sending unmanned aerial vehicles into foreign countries. And I guess I'm curious about how the drone becomes a kind of moving exclave, so to speak, and how one uses technology to expand an imperium along specific routes that are in airspace and not in land space, and come with maps of the territory embedded into the drone system and the remote operator, etc. But anyway, I mentioned
who's in Arizona,
but the drone becomes this interesting technological figure for this kind of distributed, non-terrestrial sovereign power.
No, I think it's a great set of questions. The only thing I think would definitely be worth exploring, especially as Schmidt's argument is that the nomos is only produced through these kinds of oppositional conflicts, through war. War is the sort of structure of this world. So the way in which the war becomes this very different geography of this as well is very interesting. I think the question to look at this as well would be in terms of the history of the history of vision within aerial warfare to begin with, of which Virilio's War in Cinema is sort of an endlessly useful resource for this as well. But in the sense that you've got this, the law of the sea and of which most warfare was on the naval warfare. Well, the law of the sea was one in which 2/3 of the planet had no state capacity to partition or own this, right? It's perfectly legal for the Soviets to send submarines over right off of the shore, and we would send submarines over there, and people would send their armies, or their navies, obviously, to different parts of the world in a way in which that this sort of things as well. But to make this move in which the land itself becomes naval, where the land becomes a naval kind of glacis, a surface over which those kinds of movements are possible is a tremendous sort of shift within this as well. Yeah. So I think I don't have a specific comment other than to say I think the observation is exactly correct, and that a lot of the things that we're talking about here are neatly and clearly identified within that transformation towards these remote control structures of vision, and the way in which they fold very different kinds of spaces into them.
Yeah.
An operator in Arizona and a drone in Pakistan, and an order given in Washington D.C.
Or Tampa,
or
like the other drone capital.
San Diego is one of the big drone capitals. We build a lot of drones. It sounds all proud and everything.
Drone
patriotic, yeah. But General Dynamics, a lot of the drones, General Atomics builds a lot of the drones that are right across the freeway from UCSD. But this is yeah.
Well, cool. That was amazing. It's fascinating to talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.